Well, greetings, students. Here we are again trying to master the intricacies of symbolic logic. And I'm getting a little tired here. Been recording videos all day long, but I think I have it in me to give you one more lesson. So let's get at it. Now, in doing more complicated symbolizations, we'll often face the issues we've considered before all at once. So you have to use everything you've learned up to this point to master a more complex symbolization. It's like building things out of Lego blocks, and if you don't get the first little pieces, master putting the first little pieces together, you take those little pieces and build them into bigger pieces. Then you take that bigger piece and build it as a component into an even bigger one. But if you don't get those little pieces together correctly, you can't get the big ones together correctly. So you have to absolutely master the elements as we go along, right? Symbolizing can be difficult, but this is where the logical rubber hits the road, so to speak, where we begin to practice the skills necessary for applying logic to real live arguments. Now, the key to doing a translation of a more complicated proposition is to first establish its overall form by identifying its major operator. Is it a conditional, a biconditional, a disjunction, a conjunction? And then to break it up into its components in a sort of step-by-step process. And there's many ways to go about that. I just want to show you some ways I've used to try to deal with this. Consider this proposition, where someone is obviously thinking about a well-known incident in history when the rebels went to try to destroy the second Death Star, and they ended up on the moon of Endor, right? And there they faced this situation. If the Ewoks befriend the rebels, then the Empire will be defeated, and the second Death Star will be destroyed. Now, of course, we always create a dictionary. E for Ewoks befriend the rebels, D for the Empire will be defeated, and W for the second Death Star will be destroyed. And if you look at the overall form, we have an if and a then and, right? And the if-then goes together. This if and then joins these two components together. And then we have and the second Death Star will be destroyed. So if E, then D and W, right? E, arrow, D, ampersand, W. Recall that time in the ancient histories of Middle-earth when the dwarves came thinking Bilbo was a burglar. Of course, Gandalf had set him up. And the dwarves started eating poor old Bilbo out of house and home. Remember? If he's a hobbit, then he loves second breakfast. But the dwarves have eaten all the extra helpings. Right? So we make ourselves a dictionary. I've got a longer dictionary here because we're going to be looking at some other things too. But he's a hobbit. He loves second breakfast. And the dwarves have eaten all the extra helpings. So we have if, then, but the comma and the but are a key that the but here, or the and, is the major operator. So, if he's a hobbit, then he loves second breakfast, and the dwarves have eaten all the extra helpings. This has the overall form of a conjunction. Now, there's that other famous incident you will no doubt recall when the Fellowship, right, Aragorn and the hobbits, well, before they became the Fellowship, but you remember when Aragorn met the hobbits at the sign of the Prancing Pony? So then they all got together and left, and they're on their way out, and Merry and Pippin said, "What about second breakfast?" And Aragorn threw him an apple. This one's kind of tricky, so look at it. If he loves second breakfast, if he's a hobbit, then Aragorn will throw him an apple. So look at the if-then first. We want to break up the if-then. But then we notice up in here there's another if, right? If he loves second breakfast, if he's a hobbit, then Aragorn will throw him an apple. So this whole little unit here, this whole proposition here, is the antecedent. And there's an if by itself in the middle. So that becomes if he's a hobbit, then he loves second breakfast, then Aragorn will throw him an apple. Right? And that becomes if And there's that. If H, then L, then A. Okay? So you want to meditate on this one a bit. This is a tricky one. The tricky one is because you have this whole statement here in the antecedent, and it's got an if in the middle of it. Remember an if by itself. He loves second breakfast if he's a hobbit means if he's a hobbit, then he loves second breakfast. Again, you have to sort of study these examples, let them sink in, right? And then try to translate them again without looking at the answer, then go back and check yourself, and then see how that's going to work out for you. Now consider this one. He's a hobbit only if he loves second breakfast, or the dwarves have eaten all the second helpings. But Aragorn will throw him an apple. Now here, this gives us the clue, the semicolon. The semicolon in English grammar, as you probably know, indicates we're joining together two things that can stand together separately. So wherever you see this semicolon, that's a sign that what comes immediately afterward is going to be the main operator. So the main operator is but. And we have, he's a hobbit only if he loves second breakfast, or the dwarves have eaten all the second helpings. We could just look at that portion all by itself and translate it, right? Remember, in only if, you don't move or change anything. P only if Q means if P, then Q. So, if he's a hobbit, then he loves second breakfast. He's a hobbit only if he loves second breakfast, or the dwarves have eaten all the second helpings, and that whole unit becomes the left side of the disjunction, or the conjunction, excuse me, I'm getting sleepy here. It's been a long day. And the right side, Aragorn will throw him an apple. So, if H, then L or D, and A. Now let's play around with the knowledge we developed from our last class on necessary and sufficient conditions, right? Being a hobbit is a sufficient condition for his loving second breakfast, but the dwarves have eaten all the extra helpings and Aragorn throws him an apple. So we got the comma and we got the but, so there's our major operator. So on this side of the major operator, we have being a hobbit is a sufficient condition for his loving second breakfast. Remember our little acronym, sufficient, then necessary, right? S, arrow, N. The sufficient condition always goes in the antecedent, right? So what's the sufficient condition here? Being a hobbit. So if he's a hobbit, then he loves second breakfast, and, right, because but means and, the dwarves have eaten all the extra helpings, and Aragorn throws him an apple. And now let's think about this one, right? Still thinking about that celebrated incident on the way to Weathertop when Aragorn threw an apple to the two hungry hobbits, right? He's a hobbit unless he loves a second breakfast. But Aragorn will throw him an apple if and only if the dwarves have eaten all the extra helpings, right? Now, the semicolon, again, is going to indicate what comes immediately afterward is the major operator. So that but, which turns into an and, is the major operator. So we can look at this part first. He's a hobbit unless he loves a second breakfast. So we have the unless, right, as our operator there. He's a hobbit unless he loves a second breakfast. And I said wherever you see an unless, you can just put a V. So either he's a hobbit or he loves a second breakfast, and then we come to our second part, and we look for the operator in it, and it's if and only if, right? Which is the double arrow. So if and only if, right? So Aragorn will throw him an apple if and only if the dwarves have eaten all the second helpings. But also remember, just for fun, that anything of the form P or Q could become not Q then P. So H or L could also be translated as not L then H, and it would have the same logical meaning. So we could also translate it if not L then H, and A if and only if D. Now, really what we want to get down to is symbolizing arguments. Remember our definition of an argument. An argument is a set of propositions where one proposition, the conclusion, is deduced from the other propositions, the premises. The conclusion follows from the premises, which lead to the conclusion and support it. Also recall that to make the structure of the argument clear, we will put it in standard form, listing and numbering the premises. We then draw a slash, which means therefore, after the final premise, and write the conclusion. So consider this argument, which you might come across in life or even on an exam. Either animals are mere mechanisms or they feel pain. If either animals feel pain or they have consciousness, then they should not be subjected to needless pain, and humans have a duty to avoid harming them. It is not the case that animals are mere mechanisms. Therefore, animals should not be subjected to needless pain. A useful thing to do first, when dealing with these things, is to create your dictionary right off the bat. Right? So you just go straight through the argument as it's presented, and each proposition you hit, you create a symbolization for it. So the first one we hit is animals are mere mechanisms. So there we have A. They feel pain, which would become animals feel pain. Right? And we already have animals feel pain. They have consciousness, which means animals have consciousness. They should not be subjected to needless pain. We pull out the not, and that becomes animals should be subjected to needless pain. And humans have a duty to avoid harming them becomes D right there in our dictionary. So therefore tells us that that proposition is the conclusion. So we go in there, put a slash, and write that out. And then we list the premises. There's premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, right? Premise 1, premise 2, and premise 3. And so now we have to translate them. 1. Animals are mechanisms, mere mechanisms, or they feel pain. If animals either feel pain or have consciousness, comma, right, then they should not be subjected to needless pain, and humans have a duty to avoid harming them. 3, a very simple one, it's not the case that animals are mere mechanisms. So our conclusion, not S, animals should not be subjected to needless pain. And let's consider another argument. We conclude that if the universe must have a cause, then God doesn't exist. Why? The universe must have a cause. The universe must have a cause only if everything must have a cause. If everything must have a cause, then God has a cause. God isn't God if God has a cause. And if God isn't God, then God doesn't exist. So we go through and make our dictionary. U for the universe must have a cause. E for everything must have a cause. G for God has a cause. I for God is God. And X for God exists. Now it's easy enough to pick out the conclusion because it says we conclude that if the universe must have a cause, then God doesn't exist. It's also clear that why is a question, so it's not a proposition, so we can just mark it out. It doesn't concern us. It's just mere rhetoric. We could then go through and just number our premises. I often like to do this just right there in the argument, if I'm just doing it on paper, or if of course it's easier to do it on the computer. There's premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, premise 4, and premise 5. And then we can go through the argument, one premise at a time, and translate it. Premise 1 is the universe must have a cause. Very easy, that's just U. 2 is the universe must have a cause only if everything must have a cause. Remember, only if, you just put an arrow where the only if is. Nothing changes. So the universe must have, if the universe must have a cause, then everything must have a cause. Our third premise, if everything must have a cause, then God has a cause. That's very straightforward. E arrow G. Right? Premise 4, God isn't God if God has a cause. Here we have what I call the lonely if. This means that what follows the if is the antecedent. So this means if God has a cause, then God isn't God. If G, then not E. And our final premise, if God isn't God, then God doesn't exist. If not I, then not X. Then we have our conclusion. If the universe must have a cause, then God doesn't exist. And here we can think about how logic helps us get clear on an argument. This is a valid argument. Right now you have to take my word for it. So in about 4 weeks, you're going to be able to prove to me that it's a valid argument. And of course, if you prove it to me it's a valid argument, you've proven to everyone it's a valid argument who has a brain, because we're talking universal patterns here, right? And at this point, suppose you think God does exist. In other words, you think this is true. This isn't true, that it's false. Well, in a valid argument, if one of the premises, if the conclusion is false, one of the premises must be false. And generally, when you're arguing with someone and you both have a valid argument, you're going to be disagreeing on the conclusion, which means there's a premise you disagree on as well. And one premise you might disagree with is that the universe must have a cause. Well, why must it have a cause? Maybe it just always existed, right? Or another premise to disagree with might be God isn't God if God has a cause. Whichever one you disagree with, you can get straight on what you're disagreeing with. You don't have to call the other person an idiot. You can tell them, in fact, I see you have a valid argument, but since I don't agree with your conclusion, I would like to discuss one of your premises, or maybe more of them, to see where we actually disagree. And you could begin to have a philosophical argument, which is a joint attempt to get at the truth, which is why I practice symbolic logic anyway, to try to get closer, just a little closer to the truth. So translations can seem like the most difficult part of the course to some people, and maybe that's just because it is. You're going to have to spend some time studying this, and you're going to have to keep on studying translations throughout the semester. You're going to have to keep up these skills, because all the way now through the rest of the semester, in everything we do, you're going to have to translate increasingly sophisticated kinds of arguments. So you really need to buckle down on this part of the course and make it a regular part of your schedule to learn and practice translations, so that along with me, you can learn to think more clearly about all the strange and wonderful things we're going to run across in the world as we go through our day, as we go through our life, and as we go toward our supper, like I'd like to do right now. Thank you for your kind attention.